John here from Great Lakes Country. We're smack dab in the middle of summer grilling season, and today we're gonna be doing one of my all-time favorites. You know, if I'm cooking for a whole bunch of people during the warm months up here in Michigan, well, my go-to is usually some kind of smoked meats, barbecue pulled pork, something I can make a whole lot of in advance. That's always a crowd pleaser. But if I simply don't have time to spend an entire day smoking something, or I need to kind of set up a grill or a stove somewhere else, well, my absolute go-to is what we're making today, which is the most delicious beer brats with sauteed onions. It comes together so simply, the taste is amazing, the smell is amazing, and I'm hard-pressed to find anybody who doesn't enjoy it. Anyway, there's a lot of different ways I've seen and tried to make beer brats. In fact, when I make bratwurst from scratch, I usually mix some beer right there into it as the liquid for my grind. But most of the time when we're talking beer brats, we're talking about essentially simmering them in some beer in a pan or some other kind of vessel before throwing them on the grill to finish. And today I'm gonna share what I consider to be my perfect method for making grilled beer brats. And of course, lots of amazing onions that are cooked also in that beer. Anyway, enough chatter. Let's get right into it and start making these beautiful beer brats and braised onions. And what we've got here are some good old original Johnsonville brats. I don't go with any of the other weird flavors like their beer brat version, which just tastes kind of odd to me, or any of the other varieties. I like to go with the original for this. And you know, honestly, I usually don't actually use the Johnsonville brand these days. There's a Michigan brand of sausage called Rinaldi that I'm a huge fan of, and they've got some tremendous brats. But you know, these Johnsonvilles were on sale, and they're great. There's nothing wrong with them. If you can get your hands on some Rinaldi, give them a try. But if not, the classic Johnsonville brat is just perfect. Next up, we need some onion. And what I've got here is 4 pretty good sized yellow onion. You could use really any variety of yellow onion or sweet onion. A Vidalia onion would be fine. I probably wouldn't go red onion for something like this, but that's just me. Anyway, this is probably more onions than I'm gonna need to feed the number of people that I'm feeding today, but I wanna make sure that I have more than enough because I essentially need to make a big, wonderful bed of sliced up onions atop which my bratwursts will be nestled. So simply enough, we need to get these onions sliced up. And when we're cutting onions into slices, we basically have 2 options. We can go against the grain, or we can go with the grain. Going against the grain will essentially give you these sort of half moon pieces like that, and there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. But generally speaking, you would cut it against the grain in this fashion if your ultimate goal was for your onions to be cooked down into somewhat of a mush. If you're making a jam or maybe even French onion soup, something where you really want it all to break down, because as it cooks, it's gonna start getting pretty weak and even falling apart along each of those little grains. But on the other hand, if you want your onion slices to stay relatively intact in individual little pieces, you would go with the grain and just kind of slice at an angle all the way around the, well, I guess the half circumference of your onion. And what that gives you is a bunch of individual little slices that are not gonna be able to break or sort of disintegrate along those grains in the same way. So in our final product, we'll be able to grab a nice sort of tong or scoopful of these cooked down onions, and they'll generally retain their shape and be somewhat intact, which in my opinion is really the way I like to go when I'm putting onions on something like a bratwurst bun. Works fine either way. I'd rather grab a tong full of onions than have to scoop a sort of a pile of mush. Anyway, I'll just get to slicing up the rest of these onions. I'm not gonna get too particular about how thick I cut my slices. Something about like that is gonna be just fine, but if they're a little smaller or a little bigger, it's not gonna bother me at all. Like I said, this is a super easy and straightforward thing to make. All right, onions are all sliced up, our brats are ready to go, so we can move outside and start cooking. Now, another really advantageous thing to making beer brats like this, aside from the fact that they're delicious and amazing, is that the whole thing can be scaled up or down pretty much infinitely. When I'm making kind of a normal batch, let's say a package of 5 brats, well, I'll just use a pretty ordinary sized cast iron skillet. But if I'm making a whole bunch of them for a whole bunch of people, I like to upgrade to my ridiculously enormous cast iron skillet right here. I can fit a ton of onions and a ton of sausage and a ton of beer in this skillet right here, and it'll serve a big old mess of people. All right, gigantic skillet is heated up. We've got an entire stick of butter melted in there. So now in go the onions. I know, I acknowledge that this is a ridiculous amount of onion, but they're gonna release a ton of moisture, and the volume of them is gonna reduce by like at least a half, probably more like 2/3. And I definitely need enough onions that even when they're completely cooked down, they'll create a beautiful bed across the entire bottom of the pan. Not to mention, I need to have enough onions to load up onto a whole lot of brat buns when the time comes. So I'm just gonna let those start cooking down. I'll add a medium-sized pinch of salt over top. I'm not gonna use too much salt because as this whole thing cooks down and the beer that we're gonna be adding to the mix in a little while, that salt flavor is gonna concentrate quite a bit. So I wanna avoid making them way too salty. But something like, a teaspoon of some kosher salt, that's gonna work out just fine. And I'll just get these tossed around, make sure they're all coated in some of that butter. But otherwise, just let them cook. I'll move them around every couple minutes just to make sure nothing's getting too hot on the bottom, don't want anything to burn. And we'll just let them go about 10, 15 minutes until they're looking great. All right, it's been, 15, 20 minutes. These onions are looking great. They're just starting to caramelize a little bit. I don't need to get them too overly dark, but definitely just slightly brown. Most of the excess liquid is cooked out of there. I think they're looking amazing. It smells just absolutely awesome out here. So now I'll just set in all of my uncooked brats. Just get them in there any which way they'll fit. Not too worried about overcrowding. There's going to be plenty of room for everyone. Now, when it comes to what kind of beer to use for the beer step of these brats, well, I would say use whatever you have, with the caveat of if you use a pretty cheap beer, it's not going to have as deep of a flavor as maybe a higher quality beer. Personally, I really like using lagers for cooking, and maybe part of that's because lagers tend to be my favorite kind of beer anyway. Something like a stout might be a little too dark and deep for this dish, but it would still be pretty good. I usually have some good old Labatt Blue on hand, so that's what I'm going to use today. And this is what I often use for beer brats. And, well, I love it. But ultimately, just use whatever you got in the fridge. It's going to be delicious. And now I'm just adding in some beer. It doesn't really take a ton. I just want to pour enough in so the liquid comes a little more than halfway up the bratwurst. I would probably err on the side of too much rather than too little because some of this is going to cook off as we go, but we don't need to totally submerge the bratwurst. Just get them, about that much covered. And now we'll let that beer all come up to temperature, start simmering away a little bit. We don't want a rolling boil, just a soft simmer. And we're gonna leave these sausages right in there until they're cooked all the way through. And when I think that these brats are somewhere in the neighborhood of halfway cooked through, I'll give them a little turn. Make sure the other side has some good simmering time with that beer. And I think I've got a little bit more of a hot spot on this side than on this side, so I might just do a little bit of rearranging just to make sure everyone's got some even heat. And then I'll just let them go another few minutes until they reach an internal temp of 165. All right, my brats are temping at just about 165, so that means it's time to pull them out of there. I'll do my best to shake off any of those onions that are stuck to them. So at this point, all the brats are out of the pan, and what remains is basically onions in beer. The brats are ready to start grilling, but before I do, I'm just gonna set them aside for a few minutes because, and this is really where, in my opinion, the magic happens with this version of beer brats, I'm gonna let that beer reduce down in that skillet. Still got the heat at about medium high. Gonna keep those onions moving around and really just get that beer reduced off until the onions are pretty thick and not especially soaking wet. This is gonna really concentrate those beer flavors It's gonna make everything just have this depth and sort of maltiness and just an oniony flavor explosion when they go on the finished product. So I highly recommend doing this step. I see a lot of people just kind of scoop a bunch of sopping wet onions out of the beer and throw them on their bun. I'm telling you, reduce that beer down until it's mostly cooked off. All right, let's get these brats grilled off. So I've got my Denali Pro fired up to about medium heat, and I'll just start setting down these beautifully pre-cooked bratwursts. All I'm trying to do here is get them heated back up all the way through, crisp up the skin a little bit, make the outsides look amazing. They do get just a little bit soggy from simmering in that beer, and this is gonna fix that right up and turn them into the most pretty summertime sausages you could ever want. It's not gonna take long, maybe just about 3, 4, 5 minutes per side. And in the meantime, we can get our buns toasted. Highly recommend toasting your buns, whether or not you use any butter or fat. Giving them that little bit of toast gives them a little bit of protection when we start putting on these wet things like those onions and a nice fatty sausage. So we'll close the lid, give everything a couple minutes, and then we'll flip. All right, let's give these sausages a little turn. Of course, we're gonna keep our eye out for any flare-ups. We don't want them getting burned, but honestly, at this point, a little bit of color is what we're after. All right, brats are done. They're looking wonderful, so they're coming off the grill. All right, everything's ready. Let's make us up a brat. Some of those beautifully braised down, slightly caramelized onions. Don't be skimpy with them. And for that matter, don't cheap out on the bun either. Just don't use the cheapest store brand hot dog buns you can find. Get something a little more substantial that's actually labeled brat bun or similar. You're not gonna regret it. Anyway, then we go down with one of these succulent, savory beer brats. And lastly, a little mustard. If that's your sort of thing. Me, I'm usually into some barbecue sauce, but you know, I felt like going a little more authentic today, do this video up right. And there we have it, my version of what just might be the most perfect summertime grill food there is. Now, I gotta take a bite. All right, let's do this. Oh my God, it's perfect. Just perfectly tender and juicy inside. It's a little bit crisp on the outside. I didn't get any splits or blowouts because it wasn't on the grill that long or for that hot. Just don't know if there's any other food that's this easy to make this good. I gotta have another. I had those onions sauteed down and then braised in that beer for a little while. That is just magic. I'd eat a bratwurst all by itself, no problem. But man, when you combine it with those onions, it's just something else. And I just know that when I first sliced up all 4 of those onions, some of you thought that was way too many. And yeah, I did make a large batch today. I made 10 sausages because I'm feeding a few people that are over hanging out. But even if you just make one package of 5 of those Johnsonville brats, use 2 entire onions because that is just about the perfect amount to load a generous portion of them onto each of those 5 brat buns. I gotta say, usually I'm not a big mustard fan, but this is just doing it for me today. I think there's probably no better format for a little bit of mustard than a beer brat anyway. I'm gonna wrap this video up so I can finish devouring this brat and maybe about 2 more after that. So if you wanna see the full written out recipe for my favorite type of summer beer brats, I'll put it in a link in the video description below. Even though it's so simple, you hardly even need a written out recipe. But you know I'll put it down there anyway. And while I'm at it, I'll add links to some of the stuff that I used to make these today. The giant cast iron skillet, the outdoor stove, even the grill, why not? In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future grilling and outdoor cooking videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.